Okay, picking up from where we were last time when we did a very large overview of major groups of plants, I want to come back here to this general phylogeny of life. And remember that I said lots of different things conduct photosynthesis and have chlorophyll A. But we're going to focus here on these plants. And what separates out plants from green algae is that plants, kind of as we think of them traditionally as plants, have a couple of unique adaptations or unique features that separate them out. And those are roots, and these things have vascular systems, so we're talking about vascular plants now, and they also retain their embryo in some form or another. Ultimately, this is going to sort of reach its apex in efficiency and speciation in the seeded plants, and we'll get to that in a little bit. We're going to sidestep the mosses, club mosses I should say, which are different from actual mosses, the horsetails, different kinds of ferns, and we're going to focus largely on seeded plants. We'll get there in just a little bit. But another major innovation that separates out the groups that we're going to focus on are the leaves, the formation of leaves, which horsetails don't have, club mosses don't have. Ferns have, and the leaves are very different than the kinds of plants that we've been typically focusing on. But then what separates most of the plant diversity out from everything else is the formation of seeds. Now, if we take the seeded plants, we've got things like cycads, ginkgos, pines, neophytes, and flowering plants. I'm going to ignore a lot of these other kind of side groups like cycads, ginkgos, and neophytes, and we're going to focus on pines and then get into flowering plants because that's going to be plenty for us to keep us busy. Just a quick reminder, cycads are things that look like this. People love planting them in their yards and outside of malls in like Florida and South Alabama. They're a pretty cool group of plants. And we're going to focus on the pines in a little bit. Of course, we all remember ginkgos. Neophytes are important because there's a few medicinal plants in that group, but again, we're going to sidestep that. So let's start talking about conifers. This is a large group known as the Coniferophyta, or the conifers. They include some of the largest plants that have ever existed and that currently exist. For example, the sequoia. They also include some of the oldest plants. This particular individual is known as Methuselah, and it's been cored. In other words, they've aged this particular individual, and they know that it is almost 5,000 years old. So conifers have some pretty amazing, outstanding species in their group. So within this group of things known as the gymnosperms, remember that means naked seed. So they're seeded plants, but they don't have an ovule that develops into like a seed coat and a fruit and everything like that. We're going to focus in on just a few families within this order. So we have an order, the Pinaceae, and the Pinaceae is this group right here. And I'm going to keep coming back to this, the layout of this particular phylogenetic tree, because as what we'll do as we go through this is we're going to start with sort of these basal orders that are still persistent, relatively old orders, and then we're going to move through all of these until we get to these different groups of asterids a few videos later. In the order that I'm going to try to go through these things is I'm going to highlight the group that I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to highlight just a couple of the families within that group, within that order, and then we'll kind of move on from there. So the first one that we're going to talk about is the Pinaceae. We're going to highlight the Cupressaceae and the Pinaceae. The Taxaceae has an interesting group, but we're not going to get into that this time in this shortened version of covering families. Just a word of a little bit of advice here. The order that I'm going to try to use when I go through each family that's representative of a group is I'm going to give you these 6 different bits of information. I'm going to give you how many species there are in the world, and this is a ballpark. I'm going to give you a number of species that there are in the US and the number of species that occur in Alabama. I'm going to try to highlight a few features that are distinctive of that family that make them stand out, or maybe make them stand out with other related families. The utility of that family is next. I'll talk about any particular features that make them useful to humans. And then finally, any interesting notes or anything noteworthy that's worth keeping track of. Now, I'm going to give you a lot of numbers for a number of world species and all that kind of stuff. Don't sweat those numbers. I mean, write them down as you're taking notes, but don't worry about the fact that you're going to have to, don't worry about having to memorize all of them. Instead, what I want you to do is keep a list of the top 5 families in the world and in the US, maybe also in Alabama. And all the rest, just think about them as, well, there's a lot of species there, so I might call those several, or there's very, very few species, so I might categorize those as few. So you're going to end up with a long list of a lot of families that have several species, like hundreds of species in them, and then you're going to end up with a group, maybe not as many, but you're going to end up with a group where you just look at those and go, wow, there's very few species of those. That's just kind of put them in that category. The only ones that I'm really going to want you to keep track of in detail, in other words, in their terms of total numbers of species that they have, is with the top 5. So the real big, the real speciose groups. The next thing that I think you should try to keep track of is try to note 2 or 3 things per family that especially stand out. So for example, when you think of pines, I'm going to want you to remember that they're useful for wood and wood production and for paper, and that none of them are hermaphroditic. So that would be 2 maybe useful things to remember for that particular family. Then I want you to also note any other comparisons or trends of interest that you can make with any other family groups. So for example, are all the pines, all the oaks, all the hickories, those are all woody. Oh, well, that's kind of interesting. Those are all trees. So these are families that are characterized primarily or entirely by trees. Try to put things into those different family characteristic groupings that might make them more helpful to remember. Okay, so that's going to be the layout, and now what we're going to do is I'm going to kind of introduce you to a family. We're going to talk real briefly about it, and then we're going to shoot on through to the next family. The Cupressaceae is a family that we've been introduced to one of our first labs. We saw eastern red cedar. It's a good example. When you're thinking about a family, another little tip is think about a particular species that we know, and then let that be sort of a representative in your head for that family. So eastern red cedar, great representative of this family. It's got a lot of the traits that are particular to this family. All of these members of this family are woody, and they're either monoecious or dioecious. You might want to look up or remind yourself what monoecious and dioecious means. None of them are ever hermaphroditic. They have female cones and they have male cones, and they're separated in space in the same individual. They have leaves, but those leaves are sort of reduced to being needles or needle-like. And frequently they will have peely bark like eastern red cedar does. For all the families that I'm going to show you, there's going to be a map of the world, and in general this is fairly accurate, and it shows in the red places where members of this family occur throughout the world. So for example, another thing that might be noteworthy with eastern red cedar, or sorry, with the Cupressaceae, is it occurs all over North America. So some things to note about the Cupressaceae. There's about 130 species in the world, which isn't a real big number. I would put that in the few category. In the US there's 25, and in Alabama we only have 2. Eastern red cedar is one of them. I'll introduce you to another one in just a second. What's distinctive about this family is that they all have needle-like leaves. And you're familiar with these needle-like leaves because you know eastern red cedar. The usefulness or the utility of this plant or the plants in this family are that they're useful for landscaping. They're kind of nice evergreen species that will occur with needle-like leaves on them year-round, but people also use them quite a bit for woodworking. So there's cedar panels that people will have on their floors or on their walls, cedar chests, cedar closets, things like that. Um, One noteworthy feature, I'm going to go back up one slide. These things that are often referred to as berries, which are actually cones, oddly enough, these berries in eastern red cedar are used to flavor gin. Not a particularly good flavor, nonetheless, that's their utility. And that's kind of an interesting side note with eastern red cedar, a member of the Cupressaceae. Another member, remember that in Alabama we only have 2 species in this family, another member of the Cupressaceae is bald cypress. So they're very characteristic of kind of aquatic, swampy habitats in the south of the U.S. So 2 representatives of the Cupressaceae. These guys have very different kinds of needles than eastern red cedar, but nonetheless those are unique or sort of distinguishing features of this family. So next we're going to move on to a family that you all are much more familiar with, the Pinaceae, which includes both pines and firs, but also hemlocks and spruces. Now we probably haven't seen a whole lot of hemlocks, spruces, or firs, but if you've seen Christmas trees, then you've seen some of these. Let's jump right down here to this to start with. In the world there's 250 species, so a good bit more. In the US there's 60, in Alabama there's 9. So we've got a decent number of pines, but not really that many to keep track of. I guess I would call these a few kind of species or a family as well. What's distinctive about these is, as you remember, the needles occur in fascicles, and it's not really easy to see in the upper part of this twig, but there we have a fascicle and the needles are sheathed in there. So they have fascicles and very distinctive male and female cones. Their use is largely for paper, wood, and also for resins that are made into different kinds of medicines, solvents, cleaners, perfumes, etc. Turpentine is derived from members of the Pinaceae, so is paint thinner, varnish, pine tar, etc. So a very, very useful family. Pretty much all the wood used in construction comes from pine trees, and largely, especially in the southeastern U.S., that comes from loblolly pine, the plant that we can grow almost like corn. It's planted in rows, it's harvested in rows, it grows very quickly. It's one of our main pine crops. Something to note about the worldwide distribution of pines, this red area shows where they are native. They've been replanted throughout the southern hemisphere, but pines are primarily native to the northern hemisphere. They're generally absent, again, in a native state from the southern hemisphere and from the tropics. These plants, like members of the Cupressaceae, are also either monoecious or dioecious, and they are never hermaphrodites. And again, all of them are trees, so they share a lot of features with the Cupressaceae, which is not too surprising given that they're related. There's another plant that we have in the Pinaceae. I'm really sad that we're not going to get to go see eastern hemlock in its natural habitat in the Sipsey National Forest, or the Bankhead National Forest in the Sipsey Wilderness area. But it's a spectacular tree. We saw 2 of these in one of our early labs. They're just outside of Munger. And remember that underneath the leaves, which are needle-like but not really sharp, there are those 2 rows of stomata. Now they have male and female cones as well, and you remember that these female cones are relatively distinctive. They're very small with big overlapping scales. So that's it for the gymnosperms. We're going to kind of skip past all the rest of the gymnosperms, and now we're going to jump into angiosperms. Several unique features occur in the angiosperms that set them apart from all the other plants. So in other words, all the pines and a bunch of other groups, ferns, things like that. So the synapomorphies, the things that are unique about angiosperms that set them apart, are that they have seeds that are enclosed within a carpel. They are the seed plants. They have a reduced female gametophyte. We haven't really talked about plant life cycles, but that's just something to note and then maybe come back to later on. They have double fertilization with the endosperm. Remember, I talked about the importance of the presence of endosperm and what that does for both the developing embryo and for humans. And lots of genetic work has been done with these groups to try to determine where different species occur within this lineage. Recent DNA and other evidence supports a few basal dicot families. So we'll call these traditional dicots, but really nowadays they are separated out. They are no longer in the traditional dicots. We're going to call those eudicots from here on out. These are the typical dicots, or the true dicots. Those are the eudicot group. But instead we have these traditionally called dicots, but actually are much more ancestral and different in many ways. As I said earlier, the angiosperms are where a large portion of the plant diversity in the world comes from. There's over 257,000 species that currently exist, and we're discovering more and more all the time. They account for a large portion of all the diversity of plant life. Many of the relationships, taxonomic relationships, and even familial, all the way up to the family level, remain somewhat unclear. And these are a relatively old group, but nowhere near as old as pines and ferns and things like that. Again, these key innovations are that flowers are showy, they actually have flowers, they have embryos that develop within enclosed seeds, unlike the naked seeds of members of the gymnosperm clade. And these flowering plants, as I said earlier on, kind of separate out into these sort of ancient groups or older groups that we're going to refer to as paleoherbs, and the Magnoliaceae. These are things that were typically thought of as being dicots, but are unique in ways such that we have another group known as the eudicots, or the true dicot group. And when we get a little bit farther on down the road, we'll start talking about monocots. So monocots, magnolias, these paleoherbs, the eudicots, these are all seeded plants, but they're not one cohesive group. This is another slide that represents the relationship among all those different groups. And we're not going to get into all of these older groups in a large amount of detail. We're going to very briefly touch on some of these. We're going to spend most of our time in the eudicots and monocots. So our order is going to go in the same way, and we're going to keep looking at the same phylogenetic tree. Last group of plants that we talked about were these pines. Now we're going to move here into this part of the phylogeny in this group that is often referred to as the primitive orders, although primitive isn't a great term because it means that they're sort of old or bad or inefficient or something like that. But we should just think of them as being old. They're old, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're poorly adapted. The groups that we're going to focus on here, there's a lot of interesting things, but we're going to focus on a couple of these groups here before we move on to monocots. The Nymphaeales, now this is actually an order, not a family, but the Nymphaeales includes a whole bunch of really interesting plants. Here I've highlighted one, the white water lily, and another over on the right side, the giant Amazon water lily. These things are really huge, almost entirely aquatic, this whole family of plants, this entire order of plants. The Nymphaeales have a relatively small number of species in the world, about 80, and the U.S. has representatives of all of those groups. Alabama has only about 5 because these are typically a little more tropical. They are all aquatic, so that's a distinctive feature. They're there's not a lot of use to these groups of plants. So if there's anything, there's ornamental use. But what's really interesting about them, and the reason why I include them in this material, is that they have some of what we call primitive traits. Now, some of these primitive traits are retained in some of the older families of plants that we're going to talk about in just a little bit, and then those traits tend to get modified and sort of lost as plants go on. Some of these primitive or sort of ancestral traits are that they tend to have perfect flowers. Remember that perfect means they have both male and female parts together in the same flower. This is unique from the pines, and it's kind of a novel adaptation of these more ancestral plant groups, but it separates them out from the pines. Their flower parts are arranged in spirals, which is an ancestral trait. And the petals gradually transition to be stamens. So if you look at this flower, as you get kind of closer and closer in these spirals, they sort of gradually transition to be stamens. And that's kind of a weird feature. Until you really look closely at it, you wouldn't really notice it. But it's something that will come up again in another group that I'll talk about in just a second. That next group is the Magnoliaceae. So we've kind of skipped a whole bunch of other stuff. We're going to just focus on this one order, and in particular this one family, the Magnoliaceae. Now you know magnolias fairly well because you've grown up in the southeast. Southeastern U.S. is where a large portion of the world's diversity of magnolias occur. Also in southeastern Asia. But really, there's not a lot of magnolias throughout the rest of the world, which feels weird to us because we're used to seeing a lot of them, but they are absent from a large portion of the rest of the world. There's about 220 species total in the world, and there's a lot of local species kind of here and there. There's 11 species, that's it, in the United States, but Alabama has 10 of those 11, which kind of is cool. So I would again put this group of plants into a fairly species poor family category. What's distinctive about members of the Magnoliaceae is they have these stipule scars that encircle the twigs, and you remember we saw that early on with the magnolia that I collected from just outside of Stevens. Their usefulness is primarily as ornamental plants. They're kind of pretty. They have evergreen. Some of them have evergreen leaves, like the big leaf southern magnolia, and so they're kind of nice looking year round. But remember how I said that the Nymphaeales, members of the Nymphaeales, have flower parts in spirals? Do you remember too that we looked at a dissected flower of a magnolia in class? Same kind of deal. Flower parts are in spirals. They have numerous petals, numerous anthers, numerous stigmas. So this is a trait that they share in common with these sort of primitive or older traits or older families. Some interesting aspects about the Magnoliaceae. Remember those stipule scars that encircle the twig. In Alabama, the largest tree that we have is a tulip poplar that occurs in the Sipsey. This is another kind of magnolia which should be flowering sort of early mid-April in Alabama, maybe even is flowering at the time that I make this video. And this is a plant called the tulip tree. Tulip tree is kind of interesting. It's a real common tree, and it's the state tree of, I think, Tennessee. There's a little bit of folklore about Native Americans using tulip trees as great canoe trees. They're very tall, they're very straight, and the wood is not terribly tough, so it's easy to hollow it out and make canoes out of it. Let's do one more family in this group. So again, we're kind of talking about a lot of these more ancestral groups of plants here. Let's focus on this order, the Laurales, and then just this one family, Lauraceae. The Laurales is an interesting order because although they're not super species rich, there's more species of members of the Laurales than there are magnolias. but they have some economically very important plants in this group. Lauraceae includes 2,500 species of plants. Now we're kind of getting up there. I would say that that's sort of a relatively species-rich group of plants, but it's not going to end up in your top 5 anywhere. In the US, there's 35 species. Alabama only has 7. But what's distinctive about this group of plants is that they're all very aromatic. They contain a lot of compounds that are thought to be anti-herbivore compounds, maybe even antibacterial compounds, and they're very useful in spices and cooking. One kind of primitive feature that is still retained in this group of plants is not the number of flower parts. This number of flower parts starts to settle down into a sort of more common theme that we're going to see later on. There's 12 stamens in 4 whorls of 3, and they have tepals in 6. So here it's kind of hard to see in this image here, but there are 6 tepals. So you don't need to remember those numbers, but just note that this is a little more of a transitional kind of family, in that it's not like the water lilies and magnolias. It's kind of got its flower part number figured out a little bit more. But the primitive trait that is retained in this family is that pretty much everything in this family has entire leaf margins. So everything in the water lily family has entire margins. Everything in the magnolia entire order has entire margins. Members of the Lauraceae and the Laurales also have entire margins. So what's interesting about this particular group of plants? Well, the Lauraceae has several different members that are edible or useful for spices, including avocados are in this family, cinnamon is in this family, so is sassafras. Bay leaves, spice bush, lots of different plants that are edible or give us spices that we use are members of this family. So this is kind of an interesting economic family. I include this one just because I really love this family. This is the Aristolociaceae, also known as the birthwort family. Now, birthwort refers to the fact that these plants have particular compounds in them that people used to think would be important for expectant mothers who were ready to give birth. In part, that was because birthwort, things like the pipe vine, were referred to as birthwort, but lots of things in this family were called birthwort. Those plants have some pretty potent chemicals, but the reason why they were named birthwort and the reason why people associated that with people giving birth is because they thought that, according to the doctrine of signatures, the leaves sort of took a shape like a uterus of some of these plants, and so again they were sort of associating the presence of a physical feature with its utility. That's the doctrine of signatures idea. And it turns out to not be true. There's a few plants that we have around here. If we were still in person, I would take you out and show you populations of one of my favorite plants, the pipe vine. It has some really interesting caterpillars that eat it. It's got some really crazy interesting flowers, but you're not probably going to be able to notice these guys. But one that you will notice, and I've made some videos on already, is this guy here on the left. This one is known as wild ginger, and it or little brown jug, and it has these really interesting little flowers that are pollinated by flies. In fact, lots of the members of this family have really stinky flowers, flowers that smell like rotting meat, and many members of this family are pollinated by flies. Not a lot of species in this group, 350 in the world. They are distributed throughout much of the world, but there's just not a lot of species. In the US, again, relatively low numbers, 35, and Alabama has 7 species. So not a real species-rich group. That's the end of this video. For the next video, we're going to get into monocots, and there we start getting into some much higher diversity numbers.